channel. So in today's video, I am gonna be talking all things sourdough and sourdough starters. If you guys are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Becca. I am a registered dietitian and I share lots of content here on my channel centered around nutrition and wellness and intuitive eating and non-toxic living and lifestyle, all of that good stuff. And today's video I am so excited about because in the last month or so, I have totally just jumped into the world of everything sourdough. I've been learning so much and I'm just so excited to share with you guys. But quick little backstory, about 3 years ago, I did this exact same thing. I got super hyped on sourdough and making my own starter and starting to make my own bread. I was obsessed with Cultures for Health. They have a bunch of videos here on YouTube. And I was just jumping into this traditional sourdough situation, but I never could quite figure it out. My starter never really took off. It was always kind of a mess. I tried to bake sourdough, which is so tricky, by the way. It's not a good thing to start out with, and it just didn't work. Everything was just coming out wrong and I totally gave up on it. And now looking back, I'm so sad because I could have been 3 years in with this whole sourdough journey, but that's okay. I just started again recently and I've kind of approached it in a different way and things are going super well. I'm obsessed. I don't know if I will ever get rid of the sourdough starter. I'm that obsessed with it. So speaking of, here is my sourdough starter. She's a beaut. She's my pride and joy. She doesn't have a name, but I guess maybe I should name her. This is a lot of starter. I don't typically keep this much on hand, but I'm gonna be making a big pizza with straight starter tonight. So I really build it up so I can have a ton. So this is a lot, but this is just a little half-gallon jar. I would talk more about storage of your starter a little later in this video, but I just wanted you guys to see what I've got going on. She's nice and bubbly and just beautiful. So she's totally taken off and things are going really well. So in this video, I'm gonna share with you what sourdough is. You know, as a dietitian, I love the food science. I love telling you guys a little bit of the biology and the science behind food and how our bodies work. So obviously I'm gonna give you that whole background. Next, I'm gonna share with you guys how to actually make a starter, how you can acquire one or how you can make one. And then lastly, at the end, I wanna share with you guys some of the mistakes that I made, some of the things that I learned along the way, and just give you kind of tips and troubleshooting. It does seem complicated at first, but I'm telling you, once you get it down, it is so not rocket science, and I think we tend to really overthink it. I was definitely overthinking it my first time around, and it really is simple, and once you get the hang of it, like I said, it's not rocket science, and you will totally be rocking with your sourdough starter. Okay, so let's first dive in and fully cover what the heck sourdough is. Sourdough is so fascinating, you guys, the chemistry and just the science behind it and how our bodies digest it. It's very interesting. So I know so many of you follow me and love that kind of stuff. So we're gonna get into it. So essentially what sourdough is it's just fermented water and flour and then potentially salt if you're going on to make bread. Now a sourdough starter is what you need in order to go on to make sourdough baked goods. Now the sourdough starter is really freaking cool. It is a living symbiotic colony of all of these different microbes and it's totally alive. So there's kind of two main parts when you're looking at a sourdough starter. So there's yeast and then there's also different microbes, most of which are lactic acid bacteria. So the yeast that is actually in your sourdough starter is actually wild from our environment. So it gets captured within this colony of microbes in the flour and the water, and it can actually produce CO2, which creates the bubbles, which then goes on to create the rise in your bread, sourdough products. So the cool thing is our ancestors traditionally, way back in the day when they were kicking around, there was no going to the store and grabbing a packet of yeast to then use in your bread products to make them rise. That was not an option. So this is what they use to make all of their, sourdough bread products rise, which I just think is so cool. I love that I'm just going back to the basics and back to our roots here. Now the next thing is the lactic acid bacteria. Now these bacteria will actually produce acids within the starter. Now these acids will go on to actually change the composition of the flour, which will change the nutritional value, and it also changes the way that we're able to digest the flour. As I mentioned earlier, this is a symbiotic colony, meaning the yeast and the bacteria are working together. So yeast are very tolerant to acid, so they thrive in this environment, when many other things are not going to thrive. So it basically sets the stage for yeast to just multiply and create that CO2 and do its thing. And part of what it does, one of the biggest part of what yeast does, is it actually creates a bunch of different enzymes. A couple of those enzymes are amylase and maltase, which actually break down the starch into more simple sugars that the bacteria then goes on to eat. So then they go on to create more acid, and you can see it's just this cycle of helping hands working together. Another is invertase, which is actually transforming sugar molecules into CO2, and this is the actual pathway in which yeast produces CO2 to make those bubbles and create that rise. Last but not least, another called phytase, which I think is the most interesting one. Phytase will actually go and break down phytic acid, which is naturally occurs in grains. It's an anti-nutrient, so it actually blocks absorption of nutrients when you consume these products. But because of this certain enzyme, it breaks down that lactic acid, therefore basically increasing the bioavailability and therefore absorption of the nutrients found in those grains. This will also make those grains easier to digest by breaking down that phytic acid, and that is why a lot of people who don't do well eating typical gluten bread products can eat sourdough and don't have the same reaction or the same sensitivities. Okay, so now that you have all the science and the background and you know what the heck sourdough is and why it's so cool, let's go on to how you can actually have your own sourdough starter. So there are actually 3 avenues or ways that you can acquire a sourdough starter. First, you can actually buy them online. You can purchase a little bit of sourdough starter, it'll get shipped right to your door, and this is going to be an already established active colony that you can start using and feeding right away. Option number 2 is to get some from a friend. So if you know anyone who has their own sourdough starter, if they make their own sourdough bread products, they would be a great person to ask because you're often using up and sometimes even discarding starter, so it's no big deal to ask them. I'm sure they'd be happy to help. And the cool thing is, you, again, right away, you're starting with an established colony with an active starter that is healthy, and it kind of puts you a step ahead of the game. Now, the third way is to make one yourself. Now, this is obviously the most difficult route, but it's really not that difficult. Just don't overthink it. And it's actually really fun and kind of satisfying to make your own. It's a little bit of like a journey you're embarking on. Now, the sourdough starter is then going to be the basis of your sourdough bread. It's going to be your leavening agent. But I want to say something right here, right now, that I think is really important. And it's the reason I am loving having a sourdough starter this time around and not so much the first time around. The first time around, I was just dove right into the world of baking sourdough bread, which is kind of tricky. There are so many factors, and if you've asked anyone that's ever gone down this path and on this endeavor, they will tell you that they probably failed way more times than they succeeded when they got started. So it can be really discouraging, and that is exactly what happened to me. I made a few different loaves, and I was like, I just keep wasting all this flour. These loaves are hard as rocks, and I gave up. But I didn't understand back then that you can use your sourdough starter for any kind of baked good products, and it's going to have all of those health benefits because, like I just mentioned, it's breaking down the phytic acid, it's making things more digestible, it's freeing up a lot more of the nutrients naturally found in grains for your body to then absorb and use. So you can use this for all kinds of stuff, and there are plenty of recipes that are not difficult, and even if you kind of wing it, they're still gonna come out good, whereas sourdough bread is like a whole nother beast. So just know if you're getting started with this, there is so much you can do with your sourdough starter, and it's not just about sourdough bread. This is, for me, it's a health thing, and it's a really fun project, and there's so much you can do, so just don't get discouraged. Okay, so let's talk about how you're actually going to make your sourdough starter. You can kind of make a baby starter over a 1-week period, so it takes about a week, and it won't be fully mature for at least like a month or 2, but at that 7-day mark, you can start using it to bake all kinds of stuff. So let's just dive right in. Typically, when you're making a sourdough starter and feeding a sourdough starter, because once it is established, it's not like you can just keep on using it. You do have to continue to feed it flour and water because remember, it's alive. It's a colony of bacteria. They need food and water to thrive. So when you're making and feeding your starter, going with a 1-to-1 ratio is always, you know, a good way to go. So 1 cup flour to 1 cup water. Let me just put a little caveat right here, right now. I am not an artisan baker. I am not trying to be an artisan baker. I am more just using sourdough in my daily, weekly routine cooking, more so for the health benefits, and I just think it's fun, I enjoy it. if you are trying to be like a pro artisan baker, you're gonna wanna follow more technical instructions. I will leave a book link down below. I have, and it is incredible, but it's extremely technical to the point where it goes over my head. I'm not here to be that technical, and honestly, it makes it more complicated and not fun for me. So I don't wanna do it that way, but I know there are more detail-oriented people out there who wanna pull out the food scale and exactly weigh out 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. That ain't my jam, so that's not what I do. But I will leave a book link down below if you wanna go that route, because it's fantastic. So like I said, I don't measure as far as using a scale. I just 1 cup water, 1 cup flour. That is your proportion that you're gonna use. So on day 1, you're gonna wanna put, you can start with a half cup. So like a half cup flour to a half cup water, and then you're gonna let it sit for like 24 hours. Now you're gonna repeat this each day. Day 2, you're going to, again, you're gonna need to add flour and you're gonna need to add water. And then when you get to about day 3, we're doing the exact same thing, except we're introducing 1 step, and that is discarding. This topic can get a little bit confusing. It's really not. Essentially, when you're making a sourdough starter, like I said, you have to feed it equal proportions. So on your first day, if you added half a cup flour and half a cup water, the next day you need to match it. So you need to do another half cup flour and another half cup water. Well, now you technically have 1 cup. So on day 3, you're gonna have to add 1 cup flour and 1 cup water. So now we have 2 cups in there. Now on day 4, you're gonna have to add 2 cups flour, 2 cups water. Now we have 4 cups in there. Do you see where I'm going? So each day it like grows by double. So at the end of the week, you're going to have cups and cups and cups of sourdough starter that you don't need. And in those first few days, it's not, like I said, you're creating a baby starter by the end of the week. It's not a full-blown sour starter until after those 7 days. So you can't discard it and really use it to like make pancakes or make, you know, tortillas or whatever yet. You will be soon. But in those first 7 days, you're just gonna discard. You can also compost it too as well, so it's not a total waste. But the only time you ever have to like straight up discard and you cannot use it is within those first 7 days. So basically you are getting into a pattern in those first 7 days of discarding half and then feeding. Discarding half and then feeding, and always just trying to match about what you have in there. Now here's where it gets a little, it's not exact. And I'm not gonna give you full-on exact instructions for a couple different reasons. One, I've read so many different how to start a sourdough starter since I started this, and everyone's is slightly different. Some say to feed twice a day, some say only once a day, some do a mix of both. And there is so much variation because environment and the flour you're using, it changes everything. There's so many different factors. So the #1 tip that I got when I was in this phase, because it was confusing. I was like, how many times am I supposed to be feeding? I don't understand. Don't follow an exact schedule. Instead of look at your actual starter, smell it. What does it smell like? If it starts to smell like acetone, like nail polish remover, that is a hungry starter. So I started out doing every 12-hour feedings, and it wasn't really taking off. It wasn't really getting bubbly. And I think it's just because every 12 hours I was removing half and adding more flour, and every time you remove some, you're removing some of those microbes, you're removing some of those yeast. So I started feeding it every 24 hours because at the 12-hour mark, it still smelled like just straight up sourdough bread, like strong sourdough bread, which is what you're after. But it wasn't until that 24-hour mark that it started to smell more acetone, like it was actually hungry. So I switched to 24 hours and it totally took off. So there is some leeway in here, and I know there's some detail-oriented people out there who just want an exact schedule to follow, and I can give you that, but it might not work out for you. Just like it didn't work out for me multiple years ago. I did it so technical. I had the food scale, I weighed everything out perfectly, I did everything to a T, and it didn't work. It didn't work at all. I wasn't actually looking at the starter I had in front of me and assessing what I had and learning about how to assess what I had. I was just following the book, and it didn't work out because water can affect it, temperature in your house can affect it, the type of flour you're using can affect it. So empower yourself to just kind of learn as you go and figure it out, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but again, don't necessarily follow the book if it's not working for you. Now, another tip I learned when I was going through it that was kind of a game changer for me, I want to share, and that is around day 3 to 6, somewhere in there, your starter may go completely dormant, meaning flat, not a single bubble to be seen. And at this point, so many people throw out perfectly good starters because they think that they did something wrong. It's supposed to be bubbly, it's not, clearly I messed it up. That is not true. They can go dormant early in this first, or early to mid first week that you're actually creating the starter, and it's normal. So hang in there, don't give up, stick to the schedule, you know, and by schedule I mean paying attention to your starter and smelling it and seeing when you think it should be fed, but stick to it, don't give up, keep feeding it. Make some changes and do some Googling if you're trying to troubleshoot, but just stick with it because it's probably just fine and will start bubbling up beautifully in just a couple days. Now, how you know it's bubbling up beautifully is when, you know, 1 to 4 hours or so after you feed it, aka refresh it, you see it about double in size. There's going to be tons and tons of bubbles that form. It's going to completely grow, and then it will then come back down. So once your starter is created, you're going to be leaving it on the counter your whole first week because you're feeding it pretty much daily, sometimes twice a day, depending on your situation. But at the end of those 7 days, when you have your baby starter, you can start using it. So every time you're discarding half or however much off, you can then use that to make crackers, or use that to make pancakes, or use that to make a pizza. You can start actually using it now because it is a full-blown sourdough starter. Now you can continue to leave it out on your counter, but you're still going to have to feed it daily if that's the case. But you also have the option to put it in the fridge. So if you think you're only going to be using it like once a week, maybe twice a week, then you can just put it in your fridge, which is going to very much slow down the fermentation of the flour and water. And that way you only have to pull it out and feed it like once a week, maybe every 2 weeks, and it will be just fine. I want to talk about troubleshooting and some things to look for and tips. But first, I just want to share real quick. Like I said, this is a big half-gallon jar that I have my starter in because I've been using it so much, I wanted more on hand. But when I first started mine, I just put it in, I think this is like a 1 quart maybe jar. And you want to make sure that it can breathe. So on this jar, it's not an airtight lid. As you can see, it like moves around. It's not, doesn't have like a gasket or anything. So it's breathable, it allows air in and out. You need that. With a jar, you can literally just sit the lid on it and not actually screw it on tight. You can put a little napkin or cheesecloth or a dish towel or something over top and secure it with like a rubber band, and that will be fine. You just want to make sure that it can breathe and that it's in a glass container. Okay, now for troubleshooting. So one of the biggest things that happens is you can get something called hooch, which is this brown, clearish liquid that forms on the very top of your starter. This happened to me a whole bunch when I tried this 3 years ago because I didn't know what I was doing. And it's no big deal. It's just a sign that your starter needs to be fed. It's not dead, nothing's wrong with it. All you have to do is just pour off that liquid, give it a real good feeding, and I would discard some, give it a real good feeding, again, matching how much is in there, and you should be good to go. Feed it a few times, like twice a day for a couple days, and it should get back up into working order. Temperature totally matters. So in the middle of the summer, when it's just warmer in general, your sourdough starter will be popping off and fermenting a lot more quickly than it will in the middle or dead of winter. So that's why, again, if you're following an exact schedule, it might not match up perfectly to your real life conditions and it might not go so well. So actually look at your starter, see how it's doing, smell it, and try and figure out when it needs to be fed, not when the schedule is necessarily telling you when it should be fed. Also, I would stick it in a warm place. So whether that's in, I would tuck it in a cabinet or in my pantry where it's not drafty. And then also another good place if you really need a warm spot is in your turned off oven, but with the oven light on. If it has a strong nail polish, pungent smell, it needs to be fed. If it is happy and fed and it's doing well, it's going to basically smell like stronger, more intense sourdough bread. When it comes to flour, I've been using just unbleached organic all-purpose flour, and that's been working great. You can also use whole wheat flour. You can use einkorn flour. That's another popular one. I will say it is preferred that it's organic, but just use whatever you have. It is always more favorable to overfeed it than to underfeed it, because once you have an established starter, it's gonna be pretty good at taking over that new flour and, you know, fermenting it essentially. But if it's not bubbly and healthy and not just generally not doing well, it's not going, you're not getting the best end product with what you're making, especially if you're trying to make bread. It needs to be like perfect conditions for the bread to come out perfectly. Again, bread is really tricky, but there are so many other recipes that you can try that are straightforward and not tricky, and you're probably gonna have real good luck with them. So those are all of my tips. I just wanna leave you guys with, don't give up, because these bad boys are very resilient. In all of my research trying to figure out how the heck to make one of these, I have seen lots of people say on like blog posts and in YouTube videos that they themselves or knew someone who left their starter in the back of their fridge for like 6 months, took it out, thought it was probably dead, but fed it, you know, twice a day for a few days and it came right back to life. They're very resilient, so don't throw it out, don't give up. 9 times out of 10, unless it's like literally moldy, you can probably revive it. Our ancestors, you guys, used to pass down sourdough starters through the generations, literally. So if you can imagine all of those lovely pioneer women, do you think they ever had a starter that needed to be revived? Yeah, I'm sure. And they still pass it down to their granddaughters. So these things are resilient. Don't give up, just have fun with it, dive in. Try and create your own, you know, develop your own instincts when it comes to your sourdough starter and trust those versus always just going by the book because it may not work. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope this gave you tons of information and you now have lots of knowledge on sourdough starter. I am like so passionate about these. If you can't tell, I just think they're fascinating and fun to use and I have been loving it. So if you guys do make your own sourdough starter, definitely tag me on Instagram. I've had so many of you guys start them and tag me from me talking about it on my Instagram. So share it in your stories, I will share it. I love this whole like sourdough community we've kind of gotten started. We're joining, you know, all the other sourdough people out there because there are plenty of them. But that is all I have for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching and be sure to stay tuned for more videos in the future. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.